History of the World by J.M. Roberts. Book 2 The First Civilizations. Chapter 5 The Beginnings of Civilizations in Eastern Asia. Though Chinese society was to grow much more complex by the end of the Warring States period, this distinction of common people from the nobly born remained. There were important practical consequences. The nobility, for example, were not subject to punishments such as mutilation inflicted on the commoner. It was a survival of this in later times that the gentry were exempt from the beatings which might be visited on the commoner. Though, of course, they might suffer appropriate and even dire punishment for very serious crimes. The nobility long enjoyed a virtual monopoly of wealth too, which outlasted its earlier monopoly of metal weapons. Nonetheless, there were not the crucial distinctions of status which lay elsewhere in the nobleman's special religious standing through a monopoly of certain ritual practices. Only noblemen could share in the cults which were the heart of the Chinese notion of kinship. Only the nobleman belonged to a family, which meant that he had ancestors. Reverence for ancestors and propitiation of their spirits had existed before the Shang, though it does not seem that in early times many ancestors were thought likely to survive into the spirit world. Possibly the only ones lucky enough to do so would be the spirits of particularly important persons. The most likely, of course, were the rulers themselves, whose ultimate origin, it was claimed, was itself godly. The family emerged as a legal refinement and subdivision of the clan, and the Chow period was the most important one in its clarification. There were about 100 clans, within each of which marriage was forbidden. Each was supposed to be founded by a hero or a god. The patriarchal heads of the clans, families, and houses exercised special authority over its members and were all qualified to carry out its rituals and thus influence spirits to act as intermediaries with the powers which controlled the universe on the clan's behalf. These practices came to identify persons entitled to possess land or hold office. The clan offered a sort of democracy of opportunity at this level. Any of its members could be appointed to the highest place in it, for they were all qualified by the essential virtue of descent, whose origins were godlike. In this sense, a king was only primus inter pares, a patrician outstanding among the patricians. The family absorbed enormous quantities of religious feelings and psychic energy. Its rituals were exacting and time consuming. The common people not sharing in this found a religious outlet in maintaining the worship of natural gods. These always got some attention from the elite too. The worship of mountains and rivers and the propitiating of their spirits being an important imperial duty from early times. But they were to influence the central developments of Chinese thought less than similar notions in other religions. Religion had considerable repercussions on political forms. The heart of the ruling house's claim to obedience was its religious superiority. Through the maintenance of ritual, it had access to the goodwill of unseen powers whose intentions might be known from the oracles. When these had been interpreted, the ordering of agricultural life of the community was possible, for they regulated such matters as the time of sowing and harvesting. Much turned, therefore, on the religious standing of the king. It was of the first importance to the state. This was reflected in the fact that the Chow displacement of the Shang was religious as well as military. The idea was introduced that there existed a god superior to the ancestral god of the dynasty, and that from him there was derived a mandate to rule. Now, it was claimed he had decreed that the mandate should pass to other hands. This was the introduction of another idea fundamental to the Chinese conception of government and it was to be closely linked to the notion of a cyclic history, marked by the repeated rise and fall of dynasties. Inevitably, it provoked speculations about what might be the signs by which the recipient of the new mandate should be recognized. Filial piety was one, and to this extent, a conservative principle was implicit. But the Chow writers also introduced an idea rendered not very comfortably into English by the word virtue. Clearly, its content remained fluid, disagreement and discussion were therefore possible. In its earliest forms, the Chinese state, and one must think over long periods of more than one authority coexisting, seems little more than an abstraction from the idea of the ruler's state and the necessity to maintain the rituals and sacrifices. The records do not leave an impression of a very busy monarchy, apart from the extraordinary decisions of peace and war. The kings seem to have had little to do except fulfill their religious duties, hunt, and initiate building projects in the palace complexes which appear as early as Shang times. Though there are indications of Chao kings also undertaking, with the labor of prisoners, extensive agricultural colonization. For a long time, the early Chinese rulers did without any considerable bureaucracy. Gradually, a hierarchy of ministers emerged who regulated court life. But the king was a landowner who, for the most part, needed only bailiffs, overseers, and few scribes. No doubt, much of his life was spent on the move about his lands. The only other aspect of his activity which needed expert support was the supernatural. Out of this much was to grow, not least the intimate connection between rule in China and the determination of time and the calendar, both very important in agricultural societies. These were based on astronomy, and though this came to have a respectable basis in observation and calculation, its origins were magical and religious. In Shang times, all the great decisions of state and many lesser ones were taken by consulting oracles. This was done by engraving turtle shells or the shoulder blades of certain animals with written characters and then applying to them a heated bronze pins so as to produce cracks on the reverse side. The direction and the length of these cracks in relation to the characters would then be considered and the oracle read accordingly by the king. This was an enormously important practice from the point of view of historians, for such oracles were kept, presumably as records. They provide us with evidence for the foundation of Chinese language, as the characters on the oracle bones and some early bronzes are basically those of classical Chinese. The Shang had about 5,000 such characters, though not all can be read. Nevertheless, the principles of this writing show a unique consistency. While other civilizations gave up pictographic characterization in favor of phonetic systems, the Chinese language grew and evolved but remained essentially within the pictographic framework. Already under the Shang, moreover, the structure of the language was that of modern Chinese, monosyllabic and depending on word order, not on the inflection of the words, to convey meaning. The Shang, in fact, already used a form of Chinese. Writing was to remain high on the scale of Chinese arts and has always retained some trace of the religious respect given to those first characters. Only a few years ago, examples of Mao Zedong's calligraphy were widely reproduced and were used to enhance his prestige during his ascendancy. This reflects the centuries during which writing remained the jealously guarded privilege of the elite. The readers of the oracles, the so called Shi, were the forerunners of the later scholar gentry class. They were indispensable experts, the possessors of hieratic and arcane skills. Their monopoly was to pass to the much larger class of the scholar gentry in later times. The language thus remains the form of communication of a relatively small elite, which not only found its privileges rooted in its possession, but also had an interest in preserving it against corruption or variation. It was of enormous importance as a unifying and stabilizing force because written Chinese became a language of government and culture transcending divisions of dialect, religion, and region. Its use by the elite tied the country together. Several great determinants of future Chinese history had thus been settled in outline by the end of the Chao period. That end came after increasing signs of social changes which were affecting the operation of the major institutions. This is not surprising. China long remained basically agricultural, and change was often initiated by the pressure of population upon resources. This accounts for the impact of the introduction of iron, probably in use by about 500 BC. As elsewhere, a sharp rise in agricultural production and therefore in population followed. The first tools which have been found come from the 5th century BC. Iron weapons came later. At an early date, too, tools were made by casting, as iron molds for sickle blades have been found dating from the 4th or 5th century. Chinese technique in handling the new metal was thus advanced in very early times. Whether by development from bronze casting or by experiments with pottery furnaces, which could produce high temperatures, China somehow arrived at the casting of iron at about the same time as knowledge of how to forge it. Exact precedence is unimportant. What is noteworthy is that sufficiently high temperatures for casting were not available elsewhere for another 19th centuries or so. Another important change under the Chao dynasty was a great growth of cities. They tended to be sited on plains near rivers, but the first of them had probably taken their shape and location from the use of landowners' temples as the center of administration for their states. This drew to them other temples, those of the popular nature gods, as communities collected about them. Then, under the Shang, a new scale of government begins to make itself felt. We find stamped earth ramparts, specialized aristocratic and court quarters, and the remains of large buildings. At Anyang, a Shank capital in about 1300 BC, there were metal foundries and potters' kilns, as well as palaces and a royal graveyard. By late Chao times, the capital, Wangcheng, is surrounded by a rectangle of earth walls, each nearly 3 kilometers long. There were scores of cities by 500 BC, and their prevalence implies an increasingly varied society. Many of them had three well defined areas: a small enclosure where the aristocracy lived, a larger one inhabited by specialized craftsmen and merchants, and the fields outside the walls which fed the city. The merchant class was another important development. It may not have been much regarded by the landowners, but well before 1000 BC, a cowrie shell currency was used, which shows a new complexity of economic life and the presence of specialists in trade. Their quarters and those of the craftsmen were distinguished from those of nobility by walls and ramparts around the latter, but they too fell within the walls of the city, a sign of a growing need for defense. In the commercial streets of the city of the Warring States period, could be found shops selling jewelry, curios, food, and clothing, as well as taverns, gambling houses, and brothels. The heart of the Chinese society, nonetheless, still beat to the slow rhythms of the countryside. The privileged class which presided over the land system showed unmistakable signs of a growing independence of its kings as the Chow period came to an end. Landowners originally had the responsibility of providing soldiers to the king, and development in the art of war helped to increase their independence. The nobleman had always had a monopoly of arms. This was already significant when in Shang times Chinese weaponry was limited for the most part to the bow and the bronze halberd. As time passed, only noblemen could afford the more expensive weapons, armor, and horses, which increasingly came into use. The warrior using a chariot as a platform for archery before descending to fight the last stage of the battle on foot with the bronze weapons, evolved in the last centuries of the pre Christian era into a member of a team or two of three armed warriors, moving with a company of 60 or 70 attendants or supporters, accompanied by a battle wagon carrying the heavy armor and new weapons like the crossbow and long iron sword, which were needed at the scene of action. The nobleman remained the key figure under this system as in earlier times. As historical records become clearer, it can be seen that economic supremacy was rooted in customary tenure, which was very potent and far reaching. Ownership of estates, theoretically all granted by the king, extended not only to the land but to carts, livestock, implements, and above all, people. Laborers could be sold, exchanged, or left by will. This was another basis of growing independence for the nobility, as well as giving fresh importance to distinctions within the land owning class. In principle, estates were held by them in concentric circles about the king's own domain according to their closeness to the royal line and therefore according to the degree of closeness of their relations with the spirit world. By about 600 BC, it seems clear that this had effectively reduced the king to dependence on the greatest princes. There appear a succession of protectors of the royal house. Kings could only resist the encroachments of these oriental Bolingbroks and Warwicks in so far as the success of any one of them inevitably provoked the jealousy of others, and because of the kingly religious prestige which still counted for much with the lesser nobility. The whole late Chow period was marked by grave disorder and growing skepticism, though about the criteria by which the right to rule was recognizable. The prince of survival for the princes who disputed China was the elaboration of more effective governments and armed forces, and often they welcomed innovators prepared to set aside tradition. In the profound and prolonged social and political crisis of the last decaying centuries of the Chow and the period of warring states, 433 to 221 BC. There was a burst of speculation about the foundations of the government and ethics. The era was to remain famous as the time of the hundred schools, where wandering scholars moved about from pattern to pattern, expounding their teachings. One sign of this new development was the appearance of a school of writers known as legalists. They are said to have urged the law making power should replace ritual observances as the principle of organization of the state. There should be one law for all, ordained and vigorously applied by one ruler. The aim of this was the creation of a wealthy and powerful state. This seemed to many of their opponents to be little more than a cynical doctrine of power, but the legalists were to have important successes in the few next centuries because kings, at least, liked their ideas. The debate went on for a long time. In this debate, the main opponents of the legalists were the followers of the teacher who is the most famous of all Chinese thinkers, Confucius. It is convenient to call him by that name, though it is only a Latinized version of his Chinese name, Kung Fu Tzu, and was given to him by Europeans in the 17th century, more than 2000 years after his birth in the middle of the 6th century BC. He was to be more profoundly respected in China than any other philosopher. What he said, or was said to have said, shaped his countrymen's thinking for about 2000 years and was to be paid the compliment of bitter attack by the first pro Confucian Chinese state, the Marxist Republic of 20th century. Confucius came from a Shi family. He was a member of the lesser nobility who may have spent some time as a minister of state and an overseer of granaries, but probably never rose above a minor official rank. When he could not find a ruler to put into practice his recommendations for just government, he turned to meditation and teaching. His aim was to present a purified and more abstract version of the doctrine he believed to lie at the heart of the traditional practices and thus to revive personal integrity and disinterested service in the governing class. He was a reforming conservative, seeking to teach his pupils the essential truths of ancient ways, Tao, materialized and obscured by routine. Somewhere in the past, he thought, lay a mythical age when each man knew his place and did his duty. To return to that was Confucius's ethical goal. He advocated the principle of order, the attribution to everything of its correct place in the great gamut of experience. The practical expression of this was the strong Confucian predisposition to support the institutions likely to ensure order, the family, hierarchy, seniority, and due reverence for the many nicely graded obligations between men. This was teaching likely to produce men who would respect the traditional culture, emphasize the good value and regular behavior, and seek to realize their moral obligations in the scrupulous discharge of duties. It was immediately successful in that many of Confucius's pupils won fame and worldly success. Though his teaching deplored the conscious pursuit of such goals, urging rather a gentlemanly self effacement. But it was also successful in much more fundamental sense, since generations of Chinese civil servants were later to be drilled in the precepts of behavior and government which he laid down. Documents, conduct, loyalty, and faithfulness. Four precepts attributed to him as the guidance on government helped to form reliable, sometimes disinterested, and even humane civil servants for hundreds of years. Confucian texts were later to be treated with something like religious awe. His name gave great prestige to anything with which it was associated. He was said to have compiled some of the texts later known as the 13 Classics, a collection which only took its final form in the 13th century AD. Rather like the Old Testament, they were a somewhat miscellaneous collections of old poems, chronicles, some state documents, moral sayings, and an early cosmogony called the Book of Changes. But they were used for centuries in a unified and creative way to mold generation of China's civil servants and rulers in the precepts which were believed to be those approved by Confucius. The parallel with the use of the Bible, at least in Protestant countries, is striking here too. The stamp of authority was set upon this collection by the tradition that Confucius has selected it and that it must therefore contain doctrine which digested his teachings. Almost incidentally, it also reinforced still more the use of the Chinese in which these texts were written as the common language of China's intellectuals. The collections was another tie, pulling a huge and varied country together in a common culture. It is striking that Confucius had so little to say about the supernatural. In the ordinary sense of the word, he was not a religious teacher, which probably explains why other teachers had greater success with the masses. He was essentially concerned with the practical duty, an emphasis he shared with several other Chinese teachers of the 4th and 5th centuries BC. Possibly because the stamp was then so firmly taken. Chinese thought seems less troubled by agonized uncertainties over the reality of the actual or the possibility of personal salvation than other. More tormented traditions, the lessons of the past, the wisdom of the former times, and the maintenance of good order came to have more importance in it than pondering theological enigmas or seeking reassurance in the arms of dark gods. Yet, for all his great influence and his later promotion as the focus of an official cult, Confucius was not the only maker of Chinese intellectual traditions. Indeed, the tone of Chinese intellectual life is perhaps not attributable to any individual's teachings. It shares something with other Oriental philosophies in its emphasis upon the meditative and reflective mode, rather than the methodical and interrogatory, which is more familiar to the Europeans. The mapping of knowledge by systematic questioning of the mind about the nature and extent of its own powers was not to be a characteristic activity of Chinese philosophers. This does not mean they incline to otherworldliness and fantasy, for Confucianism was emphatically practical. Unlike the ethical sages of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, those of China tended always to turn to the here and now, to pragmatic and secular questions rather than to theology and metaphysics. This can also be said of systems rivaling Confucianism, which were evolved to satisfy Chinese needs. One was the teaching of Mao Tzu, a 5th century thinker who preached an active creed of universal altruism. Men were to love strangers like their own kinsmen. Some of his followers stressed this side of his teaching, others a religious fervor which encouraged the worship of spirits and had greater popular appeal. Lao Tzu, another great teacher, though one whose vast fame obscures the fact that we know virtually nothing about him, was supposed to be the author of the text which is the key document of the philosophical system later called Taoism. This was much more obviously competitive with Confucianism, for it advocated the positive neglect of much that Confucianism upheld. Respect for the established order, decorum, and scrupulous observance of tradition and ceremonial, for example. Taoism urged submission to a conception already available in Chinese thought and familiar to Confucius, that of the Tao or Way, the cosmic principle which runs through and sustains the harmoniously ordered universe. The practical results of this were likely to be political quietism and non attachment. One ideal held up to its practitioners was that a village should know that other villages existed because it would hear their cockerels crowing in the mornings, but should have no further interest in them, no commerce with them, and no political order binding with them. Such an idealism of simplicity and poverty was the very opposite of the empire and prosperity Confucianism upheld. All schools of Chinese philosophy had to take account of Confucian teaching. so great was its prestige and influence. A later sage, the 4th century Mencius, a Latinization of Mengzu, taught men to seek the welfare of mankind in following Confucian teaching. The following of a moral code in this way would assure that man's fundamentally beneficent nature would be able to operate. Moreover, a ruler following Confucian principles would come to rule all China. Eventually, with Buddhism, which had not reached China by the end of the Warring States period, and Taoism, Confucianism was habitually to be referred to as one of the three teachings, which were the basis of Chinese culture. The total effect of such views is imponderable, but probably enormous. It is hard to say how many people were directly affected by such doctrines, and in the case of Confucianism, its great period of influence lay still in the remote future at the time of Confucius's death. Yet, Confucianism's importance for the directing elites of China was to be immense. It set standards and ideals for China's leaders and rulers, whose eradication was to prove impossible even in our own day. Moreover, some of its precepts, filial piety, for example, filtered down to the popular culture through stories and the traditional motifs of art. It thus further solidified a civilization, many of whose most striking features were well entrenched by the 3rd century BC. Certainly, its teachings accentuated the preoccupation with the past among China's rulers, which was to give a characteristic bias to Chinese historiography. And it may also have had a damaging effect on scientific inquiry. Evidence suggests that after the 5th century BC, a tradition of astronomical observation which had permitted the prediction of lunar eclipses fell into decline. Some scholars have seen the influence of Confucianism as part of the explanation for this. China's great schools of ethics are one striking example of the way in which almost all categories of her civilization differ from those of our own tradition, and indeed from those of any other civilization of which we have knowledge. Its uniqueness is not only a sign of its comparative isolation, but also of its vigor. Both are displayed in its art, which is what now remains of ancient China that is most immediately appealing to masses and accessible. Of the architecture of the Shang and Chao, not much survives. Their building was often in wood, and the tombs do not reveal very much. Excavation of cities, on the other hand, reveals a capacity for massive construction. The wall of one Chao capital was made of pounded earth 30 feet high and 40 thick. Smaller objects survive much more plentifully, and they reveal a civilization which, even in Shang times, is capable of exquisite work. Above all, in its ceramics, unsurpassed in the ancient world. A tradition going back to Neolithic times lay behind them. Pride of place must be given nonetheless to the great series of bronzes which begin in early Shang times and continue thereafter uninterruptedly. The skill of casting sacrificial containers, pots, wine jars, weapons, tripods was already at its peak as early as 1600 BC, and it is argued by some scholars that the lost wax method, which made new triumphs possible, was also known in the Shang era. Bronze casting appears to suddenly and at such a high level of achievement that people long sought to explain it by transmission of technique from outside. But there is no evidence for this, and the most likely origin of Chinese metallurgy is from locally evolved techniques in several centers in the late Neolithic. None of the bronzes reached the outside world in early times, or at least there has been no discovery of them elsewhere, which can be dated before the middle of the first millennium BC. Nor had there many discoveries been made outside China at earlier dates of the things to which Chinese artists turned their attention: the carvings of stone or the appallingly hard jade, for example, into beautiful and intricate designs. Apart from what she absorbed from her barbaric nomadic neighbors, China not only had little to learn from the outside until well into the historical era, it seems, but had no reason to think that their outside world, if she knew it, wanted to learn much from her.